Welcome to the Human Experience Podcast, the only podcast designed to fuse your left and right brain hemispheres and feed it the most entertaining and mentally engaging topics on the planet. As we approach our ascent, please make sure your frontal, temporal and occipital lobes are in their full upright position. As you take your seat of consciousness, relax your senses and allow us to take you on a journey. We are the Intimate Strangers. Thank you for listening.
What's up, folks? Xavier Katana here with The Human Experience. This is our episode with Mr. Daniel Pinchbeck, in which we covered his book, How Soon Is Now. In this episode, we discuss the brink of ecological crisis our planet is facing. We talk about how our actions in the next few years will determine the destiny of our children's children. This is an essential episode to hear if you care about where our planet is headed. Guys, we survive on your support. Get to thehumanxp.com/donate to help support our program. Any donations go directly to making the program better for you, our listeners. A huge thanks to Daniel for his time. Please also find us on Twitter at thehumanxp. Get to our Facebook page and give us a like, and thank you so much for listening. The Human Experience is in session. My guest today is Mr. Daniel Pinchbeck. Daniel, my good sir, welcome to HXP.
Thanks for having me on The Human Experience.
So Daniel, your new book is called How Soon Is Now, and you're talking about the global tribe and what's going on a global scale. I mean, why don't you start us off with, what is your background? How did you get to writing this book?
I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I was from a sort of cultural background. My parents were artists, went to college, dropped out. After a couple of years, started working in magazines, kind of worked my way up the magazine chain as a writer and freelancer. I was also writing fiction. And then in my late 20s, I had a kind of spiritual crisis, an existential emergency. And I realized that, I'd grown up in a kind of secular materialist, kind of scientific nihilist framework, but I had never really tested that for myself to figure out what I really believed. So then I started to make a spiritual exploration involving visionary plant sacraments and psychedelic substances, which at that time were not that they'd been sort of like repressed and had gone into like sort of underground framing. So yeah, that would be my first book, Breaking Open the Head, kind of a, combination of cultural journalism and spiritual autobiography. That led me to a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, looking at the knowledge systems of indigenous traditional cultures around the world. Along the way, I began to reckon with the fact that we're facing an ecological crisis that is so catastrophic that it could bring an end to, pretty much the human species, or at least crash us down to a much smaller population. And I began to make an inquiry into what were the blindnesses and gaps in our world and our knowledge system and our understanding that had led to this type of crisis to be unleashed by human activity. And also, what could we do from where we are now if we wanted to overcome distraction and inertia and actually face the situation? Like, how deep would the changes have to be? What would we have to change? How would we go about it? So that led me to this new book, How Soon Is Now, which actually I've been working on for quite a long time, maybe 8 or 9 years in different forms. Mm-hmm. I kept kind of trying and failing to put it together. And somehow finally I reached the tipping point where I was able to integrate all the information and put it out there. So it's a big relief for me to get it out into the world.
A lot of your work does focus on the state of crisis in which humanity and Earth kind of now finds itself in. Where do we go from here? It seems like the political system is an utter mess. Ecologically, we're just raping the planet. So, how scary is this situation?
Yes, I believe that you are correct. The political system is a travesty, and ecologically, the situation is worse than most people are even able to reckon with. When you factor in things like the fact that we're losing 10% or more of the Earth's remaining biodiversity every 10 to 15 years, climate change is spiking, beyond even recent scientific predictions. And now we've learned about deeper threats like the methane that's frozen in this, Siberian permafrost, which begins to erupt as warming intensifies. So the book seeks to look at this systemically. One of the main ideas of the book is that we can consider the ecological crisis as a rite of passage or an initiation, much like a shamanic initiation. And it's a triggering event on a global scale to shift humanity from its current kind of adolescent, immature state to a kind of adult level of responsibility, where individually we step into the role of being responsible for the human community and the community of life as a whole. Now, I don't know how much decimation it's going to take before there's a kind of tipping point kind of phenomenon and enough people make that shift that it becomes like the new paradigm. It may be that there's going to be a mass reduction in human population. I personally don't think that's necessary. I mean, one of the main linchpins of the book is Buckminster Fuller, and he just realized that, we have this incredible technical capacity, but we're not using it efficiently or even truly rationally. And we can see that in the way resources are spread and used, and our whole system at the moment is based on, incessant growth and planned obsolescence and waste. So the book seeks to provide, a blueprint for the future in all these different areas, including the technical support systems, the social, political, economic system, and then also the types of changes this would require to, consciousness, culture, values, ideology.
I mean, is there a point of no return with this? I mean, is there a point where it's too late and we can no longer be conscious of this? Or, I mean, it doesn't seem...
What do you mean no longer be conscious of this?
It doesn't seem like people are waking up to the idea that we are killing the planet. It just seems like people are more concerned with what the latest iPhone is. I'm just wondering, how can we kind of scare straight the people that are living here into harmonizing with their surroundings, their environment?
Well, I mean, obviously that's kind of the main questions of the book. Clearly we can't go back. There's some people who are kind of retrogressively primitive, maybe like John Zerzan, who believes that we can almost need to go back to, some people say agrarian, some people say hunter-gatherer. I mean, I think that it's more about going forward, but it's kind of approaching our social systems, our cultural systems, and our technologies in a new direction, with the kind of the plan to build a scalable, regenerative system, regenerative society. So, and we see in every area, and that's what the book tries to kind of correlate and put together, kind of approaches that make sense. So, for instance, in terms of industry, there's William McDonough wrote a book, Cradle to Cradle, where he argued that essentially you could, recreate all of our industries ultimately so they feed back positively and productively into their ecosystems. In the way nature does. Nature is constantly producing useful things for nature. We can look at an economic system that's maybe not debt-based, or a global trading currency that kind of loses value if you try to hoard it. So people, instead of trying to hoard it, are actually, the best they can do is get it back into circulation and share it effectively. So in every area there are hundreds or even thousands of years of alternatives and explorations. What we would have to do is become conscious of the fact that we've unleashed this mega crisis, and then determine that we're going to make the shift. And in terms of the consciousness of the masses, I believe that's very permeable and very influenceable by media, by marketing, by programming. And one thing I look at in the book is the Italian political philosopher Antonio Negri talks about how we now live in a time when kind of the most powerful form of production is no longer like material production as it was in Marx's time, like, sewing machines and so on, typewriters. Now the thing that's most produced is immaterial production, things like narrative, social tools. And what immaterial production produces above all is subjectivity. So the media and the internet and the social networks kind of act as a factory for producing and programming a certain level of subjectivity, a certain level of consciousness. If we were able to make use of these incredibly powerful tools to, bring people into a different state of awareness, it could happen very quickly. And I think you see that kind of modeled at certain types of events like transformational festivals, where it becomes apparent how quickly and readily people will change their ideals and behavior patterns if it makes their lives more awesome and more fun.
That's intriguing. In your book, Breaking Open the Head, you traveled experiencing tribal cultures and various psychedelic substances. I mean, is this what you're kind of referring back to?
Sorry, I'm not sure. In what sense?
I mean, using psychedelics to enhance the consciousness of humans.
Well, for myself and also for many people that I know, including a lot of more and more people who are really much part of the sort of 1%, the elite, the cultural and social influencers, psychedelics are turning out to be extremely important tools that are leading people to have a lot of insight, a lot of personal healing. They're like all tools. They can also be misused and overused or whatever. But I think ayahuasca, which I've written a lot about, which is a medicine from the Amazonian rainforest, often not only gives people a lot of healing insight into themselves, it makes them more aware of their embeddedness in a kind of network of nature and supernature and cosmos and so on. So I do think the psychedelics are profound and important tools. I don't necessarily think they're for everybody or that everybody needs to take them. In some situations, it may be that a small group gets certain insights and then uses narrative and story and ritual to convey those insights, to the larger population. So I don't know if that answers your question, actually.
Did your exposure to those tribal cultures and these psychedelic compounds change your worldview?
Yeah, they had a deep and profound impact on me, which I described in Breaking Open the Head and in 2012. And even in the new book, How Soon Is Now, I talk about visiting. I was lucky to host 2 retreats with the Kogi and Arawak people who live in the Sierra Nevadas in Colombia. And they're a pre-Incan civilization that's maintained itself in a fully intact way by kind of escaping Western colonialism and hiding out higher up in the mountains. And it was very profound to be with them and meet people who are the lineage holders of their metaphysics and so on.
That sounds incredible. It seems like ayahuasca is getting more and more popular. It's getting almost trendy. And do you agree?
Yep.
And where do you see that going? I mean, do you see that as harmful to the Amazonian rainforest, these kind of tourists showing up there, or do you see it as a positive thing?
I think it's a very positive thing. I mean, it's a little, it's obviously all these things are a little complicated. As things get bigger, they become part of other forces and open for different types of manipulation. In a way, it's, Breaking Open the Head, which came out in 2002. I wrote a lot about ayahuasca, and also I wrote about the Burning Man Festival. And it's been interesting to see these 2 phenomena kind of blossom, in the popular mind since then. But generally, the thing about ayahuasca is, of course, you could say it's trendy, but it's still, when people, take the substance, it's a deep phenomenological experience where they receive insight, they receive healing. I think it's great. And also, I don't think that the ayahuasca use is having necessarily a negative impact on the rainforest. I think actually, in many cases, it's creating a new circumstance where rich, kind of first world people are now valuing indigenous cultures on a deeper level and are trying to support them and working with them and bringing funding to them and so on. And also ayahuasca is now growing in other regions and other places, any place that's kind of subtropical, like Hawaii or Florida or whatever. So, so I think it's essentially a positive thing that ayahuasca is kind of vinding its way through the world right now.
In 2006, you published your 2012 book where you looked at the Mayan calendar, and I think you even predicted the 2008 financial meltdown. This was a message that you received while you were in the Amazon, right? For that book. How did that go?
What do you mean? How did that go?
How did you get the message? How did you come to write the book?
Well, I was writing the book already. I was deep in the midst of researching the book, and the book. For me, each of my books stems out of like a sense that almost this uncomfortable feeling that there's we're missing a piece, in the jigsaw puzzle of human knowledge and human understanding. And so for that, the first book, it was, here I'm having these incredibly powerful, visionary psychedelic experiences, and yet my culture says they're garbage, that this is nothing. The New York Times just derided them as like toys of the hippie generation. So then that dichotomy, sent me out, to write the first book on psychedelic shamanism. When I explored psychedelic shamanism, I discovered that there were huge failures in the Western knowledge system, and that we'd suppressed something of tremendous importance. I also, frankly, had all sorts of different psychic experiences and paranormal experiences, synchronicities, ESP, manifestations of objects, and so on. So I also realized that the Western rejection of the realm of the psyche and the paranormal was also a mistake, and that actually these indigenous cultures understood a lot more about the nature of reality than we knew in certain areas. So I then felt that, having reached that understanding, that it was then necessary to take indigenous knowledge more seriously, because they were able to access forms of knowing and forms of awareness that we had totally dismissed. So that led me to then write a book on these kind of prophecies, the Mayan calendar, the Hopi prophecies, and so on, which all seem to point towards this time as an intense threshold of transformation, kind of a dimension, a shift from the fourth to the fifth world, as the Hopi say, and so on. So so I plunged into the research for that book, pretty much still as a journalist, as a skeptic, although now one who had a more shamanic and Jungian worldview than just a skeptical worldview. And on the path of researching that book, I had a experience when I was down in Brazil working with the Santo Daime religion down there, where I was drinking the medicine, and at one ceremony, a voice started to speak in my head, and it essentially announced that it was a Mayan or a Mesoamerican deity or archetypal thought form that called itself Quetzalcoatl, and began to kind of download a transmission that I was given kind of the sense that it was my message. My job was to take the message and bring it out into the world. It was a very subjectively convincing experience, and I wrote about it in the book. And for a while, I was very caught up in it. In fact, my editor rejected the book at Random House because it was too much for him, the kind of mystical overtones, so that I had to find another publisher for that book. But but in the end, I also recognized that I had become part of an archetypal process that involved the kind of transmission of visionary material, and it was something that had happened to, Madame Blavatsky and Jose Arguelles and Aleister Crowley, and who's the guy who the guy who started the Mormons. I mean, there's a kind of history where people receive prophetic transmissions in visionary states. It doesn't necessarily mean that the information is true. It does mean that it's very archetypally charged and powerful. So it's been an interesting experience to have had that transmission, and then to kind of figure out how to kind of transduce the voltage of it, in a sense, into the normal world, and so on.
So being told that the world was going to shift in 2012 must have been a very emotive experience for you.
Actually, I wasn't told that the world was going to shift in 2012. I was told that we are in a process of transition or metamorphosis.
Okay.
And there wasn't an exact timeline. In fact, I if you look at the book or the film that I made, 2012 Time for Change, it was, the film looked at techniques like permaculture and bioremediation and alternative economic systems and so on, with the sense that what the December 21st, 2012 was more like an invitation, from the cosmos to examine our paradigm and our belief system, and maybe integrate, other ways of knowing and understanding.
And you talked about synchronicity a bit. I mean, how did that play into writing the book and the message you received? And can you give us an example of that?
Breaking Open the Head and 2012 are describe many of my personal experiences and many different kinds of synchronicities I had. And, it's not just me. Most people that I know who go down this kind of Gnostic or shamanic or mystical path find the same thing. They find that the world actually becomes this kind of really fascinating interplay between the inner psychic and the outer, apparently material or physical. To the point where you even wonder, ultimately if there is, dualism between them, or if they're just two manifestations of the same kind of consciousness, in a sense.
I mean, moving back to the kind of ecological disaster that we're facing, is this an ignorance thing with humanity, or is it more greed, or is it a little bit of both? Or, And what can we do? What is causing this? And, what can we do
the first thing we have to recognize is that, for the most part, nature is fairly flawless and even perfect in its processes. It's been our assumption that since we've developed like culture and technology, we're actually separate from nature, but actually we could be, a natural or cosmic process happening, on another scale or another level. And it may be that what we're undergoing is kind of like a birthing process, like as in evolutionary biology, like the caterpillar, becoming the butterfly, as the imaginal cells kind of spread through the dying caterpillar and reprogram, the organism. So what seems to us as chaos and ignorance and confusion may actually be kind of like a program, like maybe unconsciously we're bringing about the conditions to force our own transformation or transmutation. Because obviously, if we just stay in our comfort zone, we're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. We'll just have more pumpkin spice lattes at Starbucks, and and the fact is, yeah, we unfortunately the system that we're living in, is a dominator system. It's based on military control. It's based on corruption. It's had incredibly disastrous effects on, local cultures and ecosystems around the earth. And so it's kind of maybe a necessary confrontation with with the system that we've unleashed.
That's an interesting perspective. I don't think I've heard that one before. There's something really interesting in this book, How Soon Is Now. You state that cities should be reimagined as the human equivalent of a coral reef that is sitting in harmony with their surrounding ecosystem. I find that amazing. I mean, how can we do that?
That's just my idea. That's not really my idea. I mean, that's from, people like John Todd and Richard Register have been exploring this idea of eco-cities. First of all, even in the best case scenario, barring the development of some fabulous X-Men like psychic powers, we're probably not going to be able to prevent, coastal flooding and the sea level rise of up to 100 feet. The ice caps are already, pretty much, on the way towards melting. So ultimately, we'd have to construct new human settlements further inland. Now, the question is, how do we do that? I mean, I live in New York City and I see the buildings that are going up here all the time, or in London. There's no deep ecological consciousness to most of them. They're profit-driven, constructions. If we have to, and we are going to have to, I believe, make this type of shift, we could look at ways of designing cities that are, meshed in with the natural environment, where more food is grown on site, where they're actually more ideal centers for living, with biking and walking built into them. I have one friend at Stanford who's created a thing called Regen Villages, and his idea is to create these kind of modular, kind of structures that can be manufactured and distributed, and each one comes with the capacity to, create its own food through aquaponics, compost, regenerate, renewable energy built into it, solar, and so on. So, you could actually put these up, and people would instantly be able to live, quite self-sufficiently. And that type of idea seems to be a very interesting way of approaching, our technology, to sort of reintegrate it, in a way with nature, rather than constantly seeking to dominate or control the processes of nature.
Interesting. You talk about how technology is consciousness in this book. What did you mean by that?
We could look at language itself as a technology, maybe the first technology, or music or something. We can only become kind of beyond a certain level of self-aware of our actions and our, capacities through abstract sign systems, which, is like a form of technology. And then beyond that is, the technologies that we create that reflect us back on ourselves. So if we think about the development of the computer and the internet over the last 40 years, how that's given us a whole new set of metaphors and ways of understanding, our own consciousness, how we function. So in a sense, the evolution of tool using and tool making is we make a tool, we have an idea, we make the tool exists as a projection of our consciousness, then it reflects us back upon ourselves. So we iterate, we make another tool, and then we learn about ourselves something from that tool, and then we do it again, and we just keep doing that. That seems to be how humans, develop consciousness, as well as technology.
I really like that. I mean, to what extent does technology reflect our current psychospiritual state? And do you think it's taking us nearer to where we need to be or further away?
I mean, on another level, we are probably where we need to be, taking more like a purely kind of mystical perspective, right? Like samsara is nirvana. But but I think it has both aspects. I mean, on the one hand, our communications technology is kind of meshing us together into one global brain, kind of one massive planetary superorganism.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, in this short interim period we're in right now, it feels that the kind of corporate kind of encroachment on consciousness has kind of taken a new, more virulent form, where people are in a constant state of distraction, and kind of like we're sort of being overpowered by our technologies at this point. One thing I do in the book is I critique this whole construct of the singularity, as a very kind of masculine linear construct, and also that it kind of ignores the singularity is the idea that we're approaching this threshold where our technology is going to exponentially accelerate and ultimately merge with our bodies, so that we become kind of cyborgs, or able to upload our consciousness to machines or computers. Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the Google engineering directors, is one of the main proponents of the singularity. But it's become a very popular ideology, and I would say it's almost kind of become a religious faith for Silicon Valley and for a lot of people. The problem is that our technologies are what have caused all of the ecological damage, right? So like plastics seemed like an amazing idea, but we didn't realize that they were going to end up polluting every, endocrine system of every animal on the planet, and cause these huge, lakes of plastic, islands of plastic in the oceans, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So, we get very excited about our capacities, and we keep extending them, but we're not very good at anticipating the unintended consequences. And as we look towards the future, the horizon of the next levels of technologies that are extremely invasive or extremely totalizing, I think we have a lot to fear that those technologies could go wrong and actually make our situation radically worse. So I think actually getting the right angle on how we approach kind of creating technologies and implementing them is very, very critical if we want to survive as a species, and hopefully even thrive as a species, which is what my favorite brilliant thinkers like Buckminster Fuller and Oscar Wilde kind of point towards.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, I think there's something like 1% in your book. It says that there's 1% of all solar energy is what makes up the total amount of solar energy that we're putting into this resource. Why do you think this is? Is there, I mean, I know that you're into the occult and esoteric realm. So do you think there's a control structure behind this, controlling this with a sort of invisible hand? I mean, could there be something that is engineering the sort of suicide of this planet?
Yeah, it's sort of complicated and subtle. It takes me a while. Like, for me, language is really important. So it's really important to find the right angle on questions like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I definitely believe that there are, kind of occult realms, hidden powers, and principalities that, we are in contact with consciously or not. And yeah, there are some of those realms, maybe seek to make use of humanity in certain respects, for energy or for power, and so yeah, some of that is happening. I mean, another very intriguing idea for me is that some of it has to do with bacteria. Maybe like gut bacteria, like, what is it, toxic plasmosis, and which changes the behavior of mice or something. The Western diet and lifestyle, supports kind of, starch, wheat, gluten, sugar. We're feeding all this type of bacteria like candida and so on, and maybe it makes us kind of stupid and sluggish, and allows us to be more easily manipulated. But I imagine most Trump supporters have like horrible diets. So it's like a multidimensional scenario, I guess. Like and it's subtle, and I think it's very easy to get too conspiratorial and kind of that I really avoided that in the new book, to be honest. I think it's more important for us to understand what the systemic path is to bringing about a transformation, and then look at tangible ways we can do that in the time that's available.
Why did you avoid this topic in the book? I'm curious.
I just find that it becomes like a really it wastes a lot of people's time and energy. Like, instead of actually thinking about what they can do,
right,
they get into it's like a mind parasite. Like, people start thinking about the evil reptilians or the conspiratorial this or that or the gray aliens,
right,
and their minds kind of lock on it. And I feel in a way that's almost like how it functions as a mind parasite. It's like a distraction device.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what we have to do is figure out how we mobilize people power to bring about the types of changes that we need to make if we want to survive as a species. I don't know. It's like it becomes very self-indulgent, and also a lot of it is just not very good information, or not very clear information. Like, when I listen to somebody like David Wilcock, I feel it's a lot of it is frankly kind of bullshit. And a lot of these guys, like, I don't know if it's intentionally disinformation, or they're just getting told things by people who aren't that reliable and then repeating it verbatim.
You mean like flat Earth kind of thing?
Well, yeah, flat Earth is an example. Or there's 150 stories, lower underground beneath the Denver airport, where they're conducting alien experiments or whatever. I mean, a lot of people put this stuff out as literally the case, and it creates kind of like a fuzzy. It has a negative impact, I think, on the spiritual counterculture. The way people can't separate what they actually know and have evidence of from stuff that's just kind of hearsay or kind of murky fable.
This is why I asked if it was too late for us to save the planet at this point, because it seems like we need a hard reset for things to go into a place where it's in balance again.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I think it would be hubris for us to say that we know. I mean, all I know is that if we were to wake up tomorrow and we were to, sort of break the inertia of our current institutions and, have an awakened populace able to, use resources efficiently, we wouldn't have to see a catastrophic, failure of the systems and population crash and so on. But obviously, the longer that we wait to do this, the more difficult and unlikely it will be. I mean, this is what Buckminster Fuller saw this back in the '60s. He saw that he said that political systems had become irrelevant and were outmoded by the needs of a design revolution. I think what he missed, and what I discussed in the book, is that actually political systems are also design artifacts, and the systems that we have politically were designed in the 18th and early 19th century, when information moved a lot slower than it does today, and where the speed of change was much slower. So now, I mean, we have now this interactive communication systems of the internet, and it could potentially allow us to, grow more intelligent, make better decisions, make our decisions with better context. It could allow us to do that at a much faster rate.
How do we move from competition to cooperation?
Well, I mean, that's the whole book kind of tries to describe that. I don't know if I can sum it up in a couple sentences, but I mean, I think several different levels to that. One is just a realization, that we're in an artificial construct of competition and domination, and that's built into the structure of the monetary system itself. I'm very intrigued by the potential abilities of social tools and social networks to provide like a new scaffolding for human communication. Like, I'm friends with one of my friends, Casey, who created the web platform Couchsurfing, which was predated Airbnb. It was like a non-commercial version of Airbnb, but you would just travel around the world as a young broke person, and you can stay on somebody's couch because Maybe you're interesting. Maybe they want to meet a new person. Like, and actually people find those to be really enjoyable, experiences. So I think there are a lot of things that are now commercial transactions, which could actually be based on sharing relationships. And maybe ultimately everything could, if we were to skillfully design like a phased transition. I mean, one of the ideas is in a way like, at some point, maybe 25 years ago, or who knows when, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, Steve Jobs was like, imagine someday we would have an iPhone. And then he had to kind of reverse engineer from that outcome. Like, how do you get the iPhone? Well, you need to have these companies producing these things and these mines, creating these metals and so on. I think we could do the same thing with our global civilization. If enough of us got our heads together, we could, envision the best possible outcome, which would be a humanity that was free of fear, free of resource constraints, no longer in meaningless competition. And then we could figure out how we reverse the outcome to get there, using technology, social media, social tools, and so on. That's kind of the idea I suggest in the book.
To anyone listening, is there a single thing that we can offer to do that they can do in their regular lives to kind of affect this global position that we're in?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think there is going to have to be a call of a time of shared sacrifice in service to the greater community of life. And the more that people can begin to make those sacrifices now, out of a joyful place rather than a scared place, I think that's something. So for instance, no longer eating meat because we know that meat is responsible for a large percentage of CO2 emissions and deforestation. Taking less vacations. Giving up excess, giving up a second house or a new car, or sharing a car, or not even having a car, stuff like that. Beyond that would be, building community networks, either joining networks that already exist or creating a group that feels like it fits, your viewpoint. I mean, I think we're ultimately going to have to engage in, community actions. And that, it's hard for me to, it's a little bit hard for me to express without people having the whole context of the book. So for instance, I believe that decentralization is going to be part of the new paradigm. We've had these centralized hierarchical control structures, and those are going to give way to more participatory democratic structures that kind of Occupy pointed towards. And, there are tools that people can use now, social tools like what is called Lumio, Loomio, where you can make democratic decisions in a group following the principles of the Occupy movement. There's a movement in Spain called Podemos, which is using Lumio as its organizing tool. So stuff like that, might become interesting, for people to experiment with.
Okay, Daniel, where can people find your work? I know that. I mean, the book that I'm looking at is An Uncorrected Proof. So this book comes out in 2017. How soon is now?
How Soon Is Now is still off a little bit into the future. Yes, How Soon Is Now comes out in February.
Okay.
Obviously, it's amazing if people pre-order the book on Amazon. I'm hoping that a lot of people will, because then it will shoot up the Amazon ranks and more people will see it. I have some excerpts from the book online at the website is howsoonisnow.info. People can follow me on Facebook as my personal page is what I usually use. I have a website, pinchbeck.io. They can send me a message, drop me a line. I got other stuff floating around. My film, 2012 Time for Change, is up on YouTube. That's almost like a prelude to the new book.
Excellent. We will definitely direct the people that way. I really appreciate your time, Daniel. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, enjoy. Have a great day.
This is The Human Experience. We are going to get out of here. We will see you guys next week.